Hello, artists. Last time we were together, we drew a three-dimensional square, which is called a cube. We made our shape of a square into a form, which is three-dimensional. It's a cube. While you were finishing this project, you guys then created a landscape picture of the Oregon landscape somewhere in Oregon, either on the coast or in the mountains. So you added some landscape features. I don't have time for that today, but I'm going to give you a little demonstration on how to use the watercolor paints. Here are some tips that I find helpful before I start. First of all, they're called watercolor for a reason, because we add water to these, which are called the pigments. We want to add a lot of water to these pans to activate the color. So how I do that is I have my cup of water and I dip my paintbrush in it, and then I just take my paintbrush and I would just squeeze the water out of the bristles. Dip, squeeze. You really can't get too much water. I just do it until the pan is full. And what this is going to do is the water that we squeeze in there is going to help to activate that pigment. So then it'll loosen it up and it'll mix in with that puddle of water that you have squeezed in there so that we can use it for our paint. So just take some time, dip your brush, squeeze. Obviously, the larger the paintbrush you use, the more water will be in that paintbrush. Also, I talked to you a little bit about the difference between paintbrushes. Watercolor paintbrushes are nice and fluffy. They usually are pretty bushy. They are not stiff like this paintbrush. The bristles are very stiff. These are not good for watercolor paint. They won't hold the water. So you want a nice fluffy paintbrush. You can even use a flat one like this, a red sable. It's very fluffy and it'll hold water also. So once you have activated your pigment, gotten the water in there, then we can start to paint. I also encourage artists to keep their palettes clean. So make sure you're rinsing your brush in between getting those different pigments. Now what I'm going to do today is just show you how we can paint our cube to make it look three-dimensional. So we're going to add shadows to it. We're going to use a technique called glazing, which is laying color on top of color. Watercolor paint is transparent. That means it's see-through. So as we paint, we want the color we want the background paper to show through a little bit. We want the color to be transparent. I'm going to make my cube blue. So here's my blue here. Now, when I paint, I'm just going to gently rub the pigment with my paintbrush. I'm not gouging it in there. I'm just kind of loosening some of that pigment up so that it gets on my paintbrush. Now, I should have a light layer of blue. I can see that there's a lot of water on my paintbrush. I want to figure out where the sun is coming from, where the light's coming from. If it's coming from here, this side would be the lightest, this would be lighter, and this would be the darkest. I think I'll do that just because I said that. So let's say that my light source is coming from here. So this will be my lighter edge. Now, I always like to have a scratch piece of paper somewhere so that I can test my color before I paint it. So if I just take a brush here, then I can see that blue is pretty saturated. It's pretty dark. So I think I might use it over here on my darker side. So when I paint, I like to do like an outline first where I just kind of go along the edge, pull my paintbrush down. Notice how I'm pulling it. You're not pushing it like a pencil. And also hold the paintbrush loosely. You don't hold it up here. It's not a pencil. Hold it down here and you're just dragging that paint. So this is a pretty good layer of blue. I want to move all the water. I don't want to have big blobs. So that's perfect. That's my first coat though. This is going to be the darkest side. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to paint a couple more layers on that. Because this blue is a good color, I'm going to paint the whole cube the same with the same amount of paint. I haven't re-dipped my paint in there. That's what I'm trying to say. So see how I have worked. Because I started here first, there was more saturation of color, even less here. And so already you're starting to see different values. This is a little bit dark. This is the darkest, a little bit darker, and this one's lighter. I'll let that dry. If my light's coming from here, I might have a shadow back here. So I could also put that in. And I might use green for the shadow. So again, I haven't used that green, so I'm going to take my paintbrush and just lightly brush it across the top of the pigment and mix it in with the water that's in there. And then I'm going to test it to see how dark it is. That's pretty dark. And it'll make a nice shadow. So I'm going to come right up along the edge of my cube and then kind of out like this. And I'm just guessing what that shadow would look like. It would obviously be a square rectangular shape because that's the shape of my cube. So maybe something like that. Now it's already starting to look three-dimensional just because we've added that shadow and we have this edge darker. Another watercolor technique that you guys can do if you have bushes is just use the paintbrush to create some fun marks like this. And this might be a fun way to do a bush or a tree. And then let that dry. Now I'm going to move back over to my cube because this is pretty dry. So now I'm going to do a second layer. This is called glazing. I need to darken my darkest side and my top. I don't think I'm going to touch this one. This one's nice. I like the value of that. So I'm going to do another layer of the blue. And the reason that watercolor artists layer it instead of getting more pigment and just making this dark the first time is that it makes it look more three-dimensional. So I'm going to add my second color or second layer. It's just the same blue I used before. And then another layer on the top, but not on the face. Now I'm going to rinse my brush. Now I'm going to come back to this bush over here. So we've got this nice turquoisey green color. I'm going to add this lemon green or yellow green here. So I'm getting different values of green. And if you don't have that, you can add a little bit of yellow to your green. And now I'm just going to do the same thing, making just marks and dots of a different value. So now it looks like my bush has form also. Just by doing those different values, my bush is starting to look three-dimensional. Now I also probably want to darken my shadow up, but to darken the shadow, I'm actually going to use the complementary color of that turquoise. So if I looked on the color wheel and looked directly across from green, I would see a red color, and that would be the complementary color. Complementary colors are directly across from each other on the color wheel. So I'm going to use this reddish orange right here because that one's not activated. And I tested it over there. It looks pretty good. I think my shadow's not quite dry. You'd get better results if it were dry. But as I blend it in, it's going to turn kind of a darker brownish color because complementary colors will make brown. So now I'm just kind of darkening up my shadow, and I think I'll just bring that orange a little bit out past the edge. I kind of like that, how it's looking faded. Now, I'm going to do one more layer on my cube. I want to wait till it's dry though. Glazing is a technique that you do with laying color on top of color, but only once the paint is dry. So this isn't quite dry, so I'm going to wait on that. Let's go back to our bush. I've added two different values of green. Now I'm going to add some yellow, because when you look at trees and bushes, they're not all the same value of green. There's light greens and there's dark greens and there's yellow greens. Now I'm going to come back in, and where I see some white spaces and white shapes, I'm going to put some yellow spots on there. Again, I'm just using the brush stroke lightly. I'm not painting the whole thing. And where the yellow overlaps on some of the blue and some of the green, is making even more value changes. So now all of a sudden my bush looks a lot more three-dimensional. So where those colors overlap, you're creating different values and getting a three-dimensional feel also. So that's another technique that might help you if you're doing the prairie. This is still a little wet. For my third layer here, I'm going to add the orange because I want the side of my cube to look like it's in shadow, kind of like over here. So I took a little bit of orange, and that looks pretty good. I don't want too much color. I'm just going to come over here and put some orange down here and see how it starts to make it darker. Again, my color is still wet. My blue is still wet. You guys should wait till it's dry. But I like having some of these white spots or highlights showing through. So anyway, I hope that helps you artists to paint your landscape with a little bit more watercolor techniques and to make your cube look more three-dimensional. You really do want to have 3 different values on that cube, because that is what is, again, going to help it look three-dimensional. If you paint it all the same value, you're going to flatten it out. So, happy painting! I can't wait to see what they look like.